Greetings. I know we're starting a little later than normal. Don't worry, there will still be video content on the channel, and I still feel fine. Now, today we are up to Arizona as we continue this all-time greats conversation. I know, Shane Doan. Yes, of course it's Shane Doan. Yes, it's Shane Doan. We'll look at it anyways. When we talk about the Arizona Coyotes, the controversial topic is always one of, hey, but are you going to include the Winnipeg Jets? Well, yeah. To me, it's more awkward to take the Winnipeg Jets' history in the 80s and early 90s and shoehorn it into the history of the current Jets, which would then kind of knock out the Atlanta Thrashers' history, even though those Jets players in the mid 90s went to Arizona with the team and the Atlanta Thrashers moved to Winnipeg. So I always prefer to look at this as the Jets becoming the Coyotes, the Thrashers becoming the Jets, and them being two completely separate franchises. And to be blunt, it's a better history that's being written by the Winnipeg Jets currently than the one that was written by the Jets the first time around. The Jets the first time around, they made the playoffs, sure, but they had their struggles along the way. They had some nightmare seasons in the 80s, and there wasn't really a prolonged history of success for the Winnipeg Jets. So when we're looking at the all-time greats for the Coyotes, to me, you have to include the Jets because I'm old enough to remember when the Coyotes became the Coyotes. They've been the Jets previously, and all of the players went. So to me, yeah, that's where the history is, and I don't, I understand having jersey retirements and theme nights for guys who played for the Jets in the 80s in Winnipeg, but at the same time, I also understand that this is a history that does still belong to the Coyotes. So I see both sides, but to me, yeah, Winnipeg Jets to Arizona. And it is the Shane Doan show, right? Goals, 402. Assists, 570. Points, 972. Leads the franchise in every single category. Power play goals, Shane Doan, 128. He leads the team in every single category. It really isn't any way to look at it. So when you're talking about the best player all time for the Coyotes / Jets, Doan's the guy. Drafted by the Jets, ends up playing for the Coyotes. Now, number 2 to me is Hawerchuk. And I don't know that it's necessarily close. When Dale Hawerchuk came into the league, there were comparisons between himself and Gretzky and some of the greats in the game at that stage. And he had his struggles living up to that expectation in Winnipeg. I don't know that it was any better for him either, that the other two Prairie teams, which are Calgary and Edmonton, were doing really, really well for the most part throughout the 80s and were in the same division. So you have Hawerchuk as a great. Steen, absolutely one of the great Jets. Numminen, he straddled both organizations. Teppo Numminen played a ton of games for the Arizona Coyotes. He is second, I do believe, in games played behind Shane Doan. Doan played a ton. And Keith Tkachuk, who played for the Jets, went to Arizona with the team. And of course, if you're going to talk about greats and you're going to talk about right now, well, Oliver Ekman-Larsson kind of inherits that mantle when Doan retires. And to me, he's the best Coyote in their history that's playing for the team right now. So I don't know how much of a debate you have with that. You can debate whether or not Numminen or Ekman-Larsson have been the best defensemen for the team over its history. I lean towards Ekman-Larsson, but I'd be interested to know what Coyotes fans think regarding that. Now, your all-time wins leader among goaltenders. Brizgalov leads with 130. But what's interesting is, and I find this interesting, is that there isn't anybody with more than 130 wins. So as much as I like Breeze as much as the next guy, but I'm surprised there isn't anybody with more than 130 wins with the Coyotes. Shots against, Mike Smith leads there with 9,570. Save percentage, Antti Ranta actually leads this team in save percentage with a 924. You might expect Kemper. Kemper currently has a 923 save percentage as a Coyote, so Ranta's 1 percentage point ahead of him. If we'd played games over the last couple of weeks, Ranta may not have been number 1 anymore. Shutouts, Smith leads there with 22. So, career leader Smith with 22. At some point, if Kemper stays as the starter for the foreseeable future for the Coyotes, that's likely Kemper's mark. Essenza is worth mentioning here when we're talking about great goaltenders for Winnipeg. He was At times, a very excellent goaltender. He became very, very popular as backup Bob here in Vancouver. And he seemed like a really nice, genuine guy. That's really the best thing that you can say about a player. Really nice, genuine guy. But it's worthy of note, your most popular hockey player is normally your backup goaltender. Habibulin, can't talk about their goaltenders without mentioning Nikolai Habibulin. He was fantastic for this team at a time where they needed it. Sean Burke, they were not a great team when Burke was there. Sean Burke played behind a lot of pretty bad teams. And so for Burke, he kind of gets forgotten about. You talk about goaltenders now that are really good on bad teams. Sean Burke was there propping up bad teams for years. And I think of Hartford, his time in Vancouver, as brief as it was, definitely here in Arizona. Good goaltender on bad teams. And of course, if we're going to mention their history and we're going to mention best of, could the best tandem have been that one year that you have Bandit Berthiaume and Pokey Reddick? So I'm not sure. I know that one season it was a very, very talked about duo, and then the following season it just kind of ended up washing away. Darcy Kemper, I cannot mention best goaltenders without mentioning Kemper. Kemper, of course, if he'd played the full season this year, 2019-2020, may very well have been a Vezina favorite. So while he stays in the conversation on some level, I think he would have been a favorite if he played the whole year. The best coach this team has had, I went with Dave Tippett. I don't know that there's much to debate there. You can look at what Tockett's done and say, well, Tockett's got some of the best out of some of his players. But overall, Dave Tippett was able to take a team that on paper didn't look good at all and get them into the playoffs and managed to have them get somewhere. So I went with Tippett. And for best GM, this one was tough. I went with Don Maloney. I know. Towards the end, Maloney, he's out, and not very many people were all that complimentary as he left. But Maloney was there when this team had their best success in the desert. And I couldn't really find anybody that I said, well, that's some, extreme levels of success. John Chayka may very well wind up on this board if I do this again in a couple years' time, but they're going to have to make the playoffs. I have to see on the other side of this that it works. Like, he's ahead of the curve when it comes to the analytics. He's ahead of the curve when it comes to how to pay the players and to pay them ahead of time before they do all these wonderful things so that those contracts look like bargains later, which still has its own risks because they have to make that development step, and not all of them do. But I can't have them up there ahead of Maloney because we haven't seen them in the playoffs since he took over. The best team they've had, 2011-2012, they went to the conference finals. They beat Chicago in the first round in 6. I remember being quite happy about that. I remember being absolutely floored that the Chicago Blackhawks lost. And if you're a Hawks fan, you have to be choked about that. Because if they'd gone past the Coyotes, if the Hawks win a Stanley Cup in 2012, not only would they have 4 Stanley Cups, but they would absolutely have been seen as a dynasty, not just a dynasty with an asterisk and, a modern-day dynasty, but they would have won 3 Stanley Cups in 4 years. So the Coyotes cost them that. And then they went to the second round and beat Nashville in 5. So Arizona looked like they were on their way up, and then it just all fell apart after that. And I am at a loss to explain it as much as anybody else. In terms of which franchises they like playing against, they have the most wins. Against LA, they have 116. So they must like playing against LA. Although when it comes to points percentage, which is kind of a wins percentage mark, Toronto and New Jersey, they have a .588 record against both. So those are teams that traditionally they haven't had a problem with. Goals for, 816 against the LA Kings. They like playing the Kings. Goals for per game, they've scored the most goals for per game against the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, again, now part of this is going to be Toronto in the 80s when defense, defense. And Toronto figured that out. Goals against per game. Columbus is the one they have the best goals against with a 2.48 mark. So they like playing against Columbus traditionally. Of course, both Columbus and Toronto were in the Western Conference, so they have a decent amount of games against both. New Jersey's always been in the East, so they'll have less games against New Jersey than they have against Columbus or Toronto. Now, when we talk about notable captains, it's Shane Doan again. It becomes the Shane Doan show. From 2003 until 2017, it is Doan's, and if he was still playing now, he'd still be the captain, clearly. Tkachuk is noteworthy in that he became a co-captain in 93, I believe it was, and remained captain of the Coyotes as well. So he moved with the team. His captaincy spans both franchises, both Winnipeg's first time around and Arizona's. Hawerchuk, of course, was the face of the franchise in Winnipeg until they traded him to Buffalo in a move that was not popular at the time for Winnipeg fans. They didn't want to see Hawerchuk go. So Hawerchuk, who, yes, I still think is the second best player this franchise ever had. He is absolutely a notable captain. Longest playoff run, really, when it's from the 80s, take it with a grain of salt. When it's in the Smythe division, make sure it's a heavy, heavy, heavy pinch of salt. They had 7 years in a row in the playoffs from 1982 to 1988. 1981, miserable year. They weren't making the playoffs. That year in 1989, they just missed the playoffs. But the reason for the asterisk is you had a division that was Calgary and Edmonton, the Smythe division, and then you had Winnipeg, Vancouver, and LA. And those three teams were pretty much bad all the time. And that's just how it was. It was Calgary and Edmonton and everybody else. And towards the start of the decade, it was basically Edmonton and everybody else. Calgary started getting better, but for the other teams, it was kind of a slog. So Winnipeg made it sometimes by default. If they'd been in the Patrick division, they don't make the playoffs for, I would think, probably at least 2 of those 7 seasons. But it is still 7 years in a row they made the playoffs. Most points this team ever had was in the 2009-2010 season when they had 107 points. So pretty good numbers right there. Now in the he was a Coyote level of things, a lot of guys have finished out their careers in Arizona. I guess that's where guys go to retire. At least did. Although Devan Dubnyk was a reclamation project for them. So when I talk about the reclamation of other goaltenders, Devan Dubnyk's an example of one that they got, who was on, down on his luck, and then he ends up going to Minnesota as a much better goaltender, and that's credited to what happened in Arizona. Brett Hull, he was a Coyote for 5 games, had 1 point, and then said, well, to heck with this. And then I assume he went back to St. Louis to be a Blue. And by which I mean he retired and just went home to St. Louis. Matthew Schneider, yes, Matthew Schneider was briefly a member of the Arizona Coyotes. Alex Tanguay, briefly a member of the Coyotes. Peter Nedved, same thing. And these are guys who, when you look at their careers, if you see a picture of them wearing an Arizona jersey, you'd be like, yeah, he played in Arizona. Mike Ricci, also on the list. Owen Nolan had a season with the Coyotes as well. And Tony Amonte. So yeah, there have been a lot of guys who've played maybe a season in Arizona, which includes J.J. Daigneault and Mike Sillinger. I'm not putting them on these lists when I talk about because Daigneault and Sillinger kind of played for everybody. Sillinger played for 11 teams. I think Daigneault played for 10. So yeah, I'm not putting them on the board when they show up. Sillinger could be in almost half of these videos is what I'm trying to say here. So there you go. The greatest of the Coyotes. It is Shane Doan, but if you want to make an argument for why it's not Shane Doan, have at her. I'd be very interested to hear it. And yes, this means tomorrow it's Boston. So Boston, it will be more of a challenge. I can't just point to one player and say, here's your all-time greatest. Goodbye, everybody. I'm not sure it's going to be Bork, if it's going to be Orr, and there's people right now saying, well, you can't argue against Orr, and there may be some who's saying, really Bork had that really long career that sadly Orr's knees didn't allow. So we'll get into that argument later, but if you want to make the argument against Doan, you can try, and I'm sure that people in the comment section will listen. Hey, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happen upon this video. I will talk to you again soon.